What's the scariest thing you've ever experienced? I was about 5 or 6 years old. It was one of my first sleepovers at a friend's, we'll call her Katie, house. I had only been over for a couple hours and everything seemed to be fine. Out of nowhere Katie's mom, we'll call her Shelley, starts frantically telling us to go to Katie's room. So we do, and she ends up locking us in, her door locked from the outside. We go back to playing, and what feels like 5 minutes later we start to hear loud rumbling from outside, followed by men screaming. Katie starts freaking out, and pulls me in her closet. Once she shut the closet door she started crying, and by that point I was crying too because I had no idea what was going on. I was confused and wanted to go home. We hear the men getting louder and closer, as well as a lot of banging coming from outside the bedroom. Katie and I are freaking out and huddled in the corner of the closet when we hear the door to her room being broken down and someone rummaging through her room trying to find us. I don't remember fully what happened, but the next thing I can remember from that night is Shelley busting out Katie's bedroom window with a frying pan and there is a big biker-looking dude on the ground. She threw us both through the window and climbed out and told us to just run. We ended up hopping over a bunch of fences and in a random person's house until the police came. Turns out the men we had heard were Katie's dad and one of his friends. They came to take Katie away from her mom, even though Katie had never met her dad. I couldn't sleep over anywhere again until I was like 10, and the whole thing made me terrified to even go see my own father. My parents had a very remote fishing cabin in South Texas. One night my parents, aunt/uncle, and I went to the closest town of any size, a couple hours away, and it turned out to be a pretty late night. So by the time we were heading back to the cabin it was probably around 4 a.m. The cabin was very remote and it was a chore to navigate the road to it, so we seldom saw anyone come down there. We had these wooden shutters outside to block out the sun, and after everyone had gone to bed we realized they were still open. Me being the low man on the totem pole, they made me go out to lower them. As I was lowering the last one I suddenly saw headlights rounding the bend coming toward our house. I ran inside real quick. We thought it was probably just kids looking for a place to hump or someone who launched a boat from our place when we weren't there and they'd be gone soon enough. But the truck drove up, got into the turnaround, we were the last place on the road, and stopped. So my uncle and I walked to the only window on that side of the house. My uncle's truck was way down a hill and he was afraid they might be messing with his truck. The truth was far more concerning. We watched as two men, oblivious that we were there, exited the truck. It was pretty cold out. We had all been dressed in coats and it was definitely uncomfortable when I went out to lower the shutters in night clothes. The men were wearing coats, but the two children, a boy and girl around 6 to 8 maybe, that they ordered out of the truck were only in underwear. They started marching the kids into the woods and what would have been acres upon acres of swamp. One had a club and one had a hammer, we think, as best we could tell. Before they could get in the woods my uncle told my dad to ready the rifle. My uncle's pistol was in the truck. My uncle pressed the panic function on his truck alarm and these guys freaked out. They were a couple steps in the woods and bolted out holding the kids. Jumped in their truck and were gone. Before we could even get out the door, and long before we made it to the truck. We tried chasing them for a while but never saw them again. Drove up to a high point to get some cell reception and called the cops. But never heard anything else. I've said this story before but I'll go again. A few years ago, maybe 6 years, in October, me and my daughter went for a weekend camping. Hike in, hike out, that's all this park had and my favorite way to camp. It was close to the first snowfall of the year, no big deal, we were ready. So we hiked to our camp spot. That took us a couple hours, again no big deal, however zero cell phone reception, fairly isolated. After our super we were just enjoying the nature via bonfire next to the water. The whole time a young man close to us was getting increasingly frustrated, so noticing he was alone I grabbed my daughter and asked him if everything was okay. He then told me this was his first night camping ever and told me about all the gear he had. However, he couldn't start a fire. Not good. So I helped him start a fire because everything is damp this time of year. The best way to get dry wood is by splitting some. After that he told me he had another 6 nights out by himself. He was on a portage canoe trip deep in the bush, going deeper solo, unable to start a fire with no way to contact people. I tried my best to convince this young man to rethink his camping plans. I did not want to see him hurt or worse, but he was determined, and good for him, we all start somewhere. So that night it snowed, not much but enough, maybe a couple inches. The next morning I got out of my shelter, which was a tarp propped up with a hiking stick, to look over and see a person clearly suffering from little sleep and very cold. He slept in a hammock with zero underquilt, no sleeping pad, and a sleeping bag not suitable for the weather. Hammocks are awesome because they are light, easy to set up, comfy, and also cool to sleep in. In the winter they require a lot of extras to make them suitable. I went over and started his fire and looked him and his gear over. He would be okay in the summer but struggle with his skill set in the fall. He told me he tried doing my suggestion of splitting some wood, but he had a cheap, very small Gerber neck knife with a skeleton tang suitable for carving or small cutting tasks, but little else, and it was very dull. I tried to get this young man to spend his week in that spot so he can get used to hiking, camping, and learn the basics, but he was adamant to continue. So I tried my best to give him useful tips to make his time safer and more enjoyable. I ended up giving him a Mora fixed blade knife, 2 boxes of storm-proof matches, and a whole lot of good luck. First time I've run across a situation like this, and I was very worried this young man was going to get hurt or killed. I still don't know what happened, and I hope all is well with him. If you are going solo camping, make sure you can start a fire. I was leaving work, coffee shop in a busy shopping center, late one night, at about 11 p.m., and I noticed a shifty-looking guy not far from my car in the car park. I can't remember what it was about him that looked shifty, but he caught my attention, and I remember feeling a rush of adrenaline when I got into my car and locked the door. I set off driving, and a few minutes later I noticed there was a car right behind me. I looked in my rear view mirror more closely when we got to a set of lights, and I realized it was him. It freaked me out a bit, but I wasn't particularly scared by this point. I took a bit of a strange route because I was kind of on autopilot and had forgotten that I was meant to be going to my friend's house. I kept checking in my rear view mirror, and he continued to follow me. I changed lanes for no reason, as a kind of test, and he changed lanes too. There were barely any other cars on the road. At this point I started to panic a bit. The guy followed me for the next 10 minutes, along the motorway, then down some roads, until I was nearly there. I pulled over and rang my friend to let him know what was going on. He could tell how panicked I was, and said he'd wait outside for me. As I pulled into his street, watching my rear view mirror like a hawk, and pretty much crying by this point, the guy that had been following me continued down the main road, but stared at my car as he drove past. I was relieved but obviously super fucking shaken. That guy creeped me the fuck out. I don't know what changed his mind, but he was absolutely following me home that night. Nearly witnessing my dog get killed. Our neighbors had this beautiful dog who was really friendly. She was a Staffy and my dog was a poodle mix, so very different builds between the two. My dog at the time would always bark and nip her, but she put up with it. We always kept our dog away from her when we could, because we didn't want him to annoy her and wanted him to learn how to behave properly around other dogs. One day I was in the backyard and our neighbor's dog gets in by jumping over the fence. Usually not a big deal, but our dog was out and ran over and nipped her tail. She was caught off guard and attacked him. She grabbed him around the neck and basically thrashed him around. The noise of his screams and her growls still sends shivers down my spine. I wanted to separate them, but they were moving so fast and I was scared I'd get bit too. I was only 12 or so at the time, so just screamed and my parents ran over to take them apart. My dog was okay, he was bleeding, but he was ultimately okay. It took me hours to calm down. I was positive I'd watch him get ripped apart. The neighbors were ashamed and offered to have him surrendered to the shelter, but we refused. We knew that our dog had started the fight and that she was defending herself. She was a lovely dog who had never done anything like it before, and never did again, until she died a couple years later from old age. My dog now is scared of other dogs, but has gotten better and now behaves a lot better. My dog is my best friend and seeing him in so much pain was terrifying. Dog fights are awful to witness. There isn't much you can do. I witnessed another one outside the vet this year. Luckily the small dog who was attacked was okay, but the dog who attacked her was on the way to be surrendered and the shelter had a policy where aggressive dogs had to be put down. There's so many things they teach you to do in a dog fight, but in the moment it's hard to remember what to do. Nothing extreme, but one of the weirdest scenarios I've found myself in. About a year or so ago, me and my friend were walking to our favorite place to smoke along this long main road not too far from either of our houses. It's dark at the time but not too late, maybe about 9:10ish. There's less cars than normal but still quite a few. Down the right-hand side of the footpath there is a series of entrances to walkways which lead to allotments and dog walks, etc. Me being paranoid as always looks about every so often, and despite the few cars, and me and my friend, the road is deserted. I turn around to look behind me and all of a sudden there is a man there walking literally about 3 to 4 feet behind us. I can't remember what he looked like, I just know he looked relatively unclean. As soon as I saw him his presence became very audible. He was sniffing, coughing, and you could hear his shoes dragging along the floor with every step he took, so it makes no sense how he would not have made a noise until he got noticed. I, obviously, was spooked and nudged my pal, telling him to cross over without making it too obvious. You may think the man came from one of the entrances to the footpaths down the side, but the bit we were at was past the last entrance to any path, and beyond the fence was a very steep hill that goes maybe 15 to 20 feet down. So he could not have came up from there. Also, there have been a few instances of people seemingly spawning in down that road, which is very strange. Me and my friend just laugh about it now, although we were both rightfully scared at the time. This, aside from some of the lucid dreams and sleep paralysis that I've had, is the creepiest experience I've had that someone else can recall as well. Flashback to my mother's memory in 2006. My grandmother is on her deathbed, and the night that she passed away my mother was by her side the entire time. My mother was the child most closest, so she knew she wanted to take care of her mother in her final hours. Just shortly before she left this world, my mother had to go to the restroom, and when she returned my grandmother was looking at the ceiling. My mother says, "¿Qué estás mirando, mommy? Mom, what are you looking at?" My grandmother says, "Eres una mierda, you're shit," while staring at the ceiling. My grandmother rarely swore from my knowledge. She was a very caring woman. I never heard from her or from anybody. Curse words never came out of her mouth. My mother hypothesized that Satan was trying to bid with my grandmother or something for more time in exchange for her soul, as my mother came from a pretty religious Mexican household. Straightforward to, gosh, I think 2017. My aunt, who was mentally challenged, was ready to pass on. She suffered from just low IQ, and my mother was the one who took her in after my grandmother passed away in 2006. At the end of her life she was in constant pain. I can't remember what the exact diagnosis was. All I know is that in her final 2 to 3 years it rapidly got way worse and she was basically immobile. My aunt wasn't exactly the smartest person. She didn't know Spanish. In fact, she would make up Spanish words for common household items. She couldn't even make a cross gesture with her hands when we used to go to Mass on Sundays, but the day before she passed away she was in the hospital. The priest who normally comes to give communion to the sick people came and was praying over us, in a big group, aunts and uncles. Suddenly, my aunt, with her eyes closed as I assume everything was painful for her, says, "Vite." And we're confused and she's making hand gestures for something to leave. One of my aunts says, "Is she saying Vite, Sabanas? Go away, sheets?" At first we think she's saying she doesn't want the sheets over her, so we remove the sheets and ask if it's any better. My aunt then says, almost like a yell but not quite, "No, no, Satanas." My mother turns to my aunt, who's not sick, and says, "I think she's saying Satan." The more she said it, the more clear it got. She was saying "go away, Satan" in Spanish. It puzzled us because her entire life she didn't know Spanish and we doubt she even knew that was the Spanish word for Satan. This was when my mom told me what she witnessed on the day my grandmother passed away in 2006, and says that she thinks Satan comes to those who are ready to pass and tries to bargain with them in exchange for their soul. Regardless of belief, this is the most out of character events witnessed in my family. Completely out of character for both my grandmother and my aunt. Woke up one morning and saw a person hiding behind a tree in my front yard. I went outside and asked what was going on, and he told me he was just in a car accident and he was drunk. Saw he was bleeding pretty bad and I suggested we call for help. He did not want help. I wanted him off my land, so I asked if he needed a lift somewhere. He assured me he only needed to rest a moment, so I went back inside and got my shotgun to sit with on the porch swing while he figured shit out. There's a prison not too far away, so we're wary of strangers at night. Learned the next day it was just some drunk kid that wrecked his dad's car going too fast. For a while there I really did think the man in the bloody clothes was some escaped convict bent on killing my family. Scared the shit out of me. Was delivering leaflets, I won't reveal which party, not long before the 2015 general election took place in the UK. Before I went into people's gardens, I rattled the gates to check if there was a dog. If there was evidence of a dog in the garden, I refused to deliver the leaflets. Pro tip to anybody that doesn't want political leaflets in their letterbox around election time: have a dog in your garden. There was one big house, which was a massive garden. So I did my usual routine, I rattled the gate to check if there was a dog. I heard no barking, so I presumed there was no dog. So I opened the gate and went up the drive to pop the leaflet into the letterbox. When I put the leaflet in the letterbox, out of nowhere this big dog comes out of nowhere barking at me. It sounded like it was not pleased to see me either. I immediately went "oh fuck," prepared for the worst, and was about to offer the dog my leaflets to distract it, when just in time, the owner opened the door. He told his dog to back off, and he saw I was pretty mortified, so he offered me a cup of tea. I refused, and just got out of there. Compared to some of the stories on here, this will be nothing, but boy, that dog got my adrenaline going. I was locked out of my dorm once because I violated curfew rules. I wouldn't be let in for another hour. It was around 3 in the morning, so I decided to go to the 7-Eleven nearby to kill time and get some food. For some reason, I decided to take a shortcut by passing through an empty, dimly lit alley where the only buildings are warehouses. When I was just starting to pass through said alley, I passed by a trans woman whose face and makeup looked like the bride in black from the Inside Us movies. She was creepy AF, and moments later after I passed by her, she starts calling me, PSSST, and follows me to the alley. I calmly walked faster, and when looking back at her, she seems to have stopped following me, but she still called me. I was a bit relieved when she stopped calling, but I fucking booked it out of there when the next PSSST was uttered directly behind me. I hid in the 7-Eleven's bathroom for a few minutes before coming out and checking if she followed me there. To my relief, the cashier told me that there was no other customer who went in the store after I arrived. Needless to say, from then on I was careful not to violate curfew rules. So I at my older cousin's house a few years ago. Both our parents had left to go somewhere and my brother was at a friend's house having a sleepover. We decided to waste our money at a movie theater because we had nothing else to do. After the movie, my cousin brought alcohol, she was 22, and let me try some. We both got drunk and were kind of just wandering around a nearby park talking nonsense. Then we saw a 16-year-old boy running towards us and he had a knife in his hands, and when he passed us the knife looked like it had blood on it. We both flipped out. I don't think we called the police or anything because we were drunk. A couple minutes later we saw 4 more people running after the boy and they were also holding shanks. One of them stopped and told us not to say anything of this night. We were both scared as fuck. A couple minutes later they were dragging the guy with the knife back towards us and his face was all bruised and he seemed to be cut with a knife all over his body. Not sure if he was dead or unconscious. My cousin drove us home. We both agreed not to tell anyone and just forget the incident. This is the first time I've told anyone. Being put under surveillance after looking into things I shouldn't have looked into. I worked for one of the biggest companies in the country, and they handled a lot of sensitive data just due to the nature of the service they provided. I freaked out after I realized what I stumbled into, and then I started having panic attacks when they let me know I was being watched. I drove across the country spontaneously and was in a city for 12 hours, slept there and went to a church the next day, and someone stopped me to let me know they knew who I was, they knew what I knew, and that they knew my secret and I should back off. Unfortunately I was kind of compromised due to a secret I had kept since I was like 9 years old. I've since started to embrace the secret of mine, so it's less of an issue now, but back then it actually ultimately led to a suicide attempt. I've done my best to put it behind me, but I still wonder who was behind it all, like was it a secret society/organization? Just 1 or 2 obscenely wealthy people hiring a small army of private investigators. Now I do a ton of research on surveillance and data collection, as well as psychographic targeting. It's pretty scary knowing how many ways they can watch us and how much data they have on us, and on top of that wondering what sort of wealthy groups or organizations we don't know about that can access those resources.